Miter joints are a nice way that you can join two boards and really hide all the end grain. You've got two 45-degree cuts that come together to form a 90-degree angle. For example, this is a plywood shelf for a project. To hide those plywood edges, we've mitered two pieces of edging, come together nicely at a 90-degree corner here, and it wraps the shelf and hides that plywood edging, makes the whole thing a little more attractive. Cutting a couple of miter joints like that, really not too much of a problem. When you get into more traditional miter, where you're using strictly miters for joinery, you're making a frame. You've got 4 miter joints. One problem with miter joints, they do have the advantage of hiding the end grain, but on the other side, you're pretty much gluing end grain to end grain there, so you don't have a terribly strong joint. So you need to come up with some way to reinforce that joint. And I'm going to show you 4 methods for that in just a moment. First, let's talk about cutting the miters themselves. You have to be very precise when you're cutting 4 miters. You've actually got 8 cuts here, 2 on each piece, and each cut has to be dead on, because if you're off, say, 1/4 of 1 degree 8 times, by the time you get to that last corner, that's a total of 2 degrees. You'll end up with a gap here. So let's go to the table saw, and I'll show you how to set things up and test your cuts first to end up with gap-free corners before you're ready to glue up a frame. To cut accurate miters, you need a miter gauge. It's always a good idea to put an auxiliary face on your miter gauge for a couple of reasons. Extend it past the blade, and that little extension will help push the waste past the blade. It also backs up the cut so that the backside of the workpiece where the blade is exiting, it reduces tear out. So if you've got that essentially a zero clearance cut there, you'll get much cleaner cuts. The first thing I'm going to do here, I've got my miter gauge set for 45 degrees, and I want to make 1 cut right through my auxiliary fence. Now that cut shows me exactly where the blade's going to cut, so that also helps me when it comes time to align my pieces. I've got 4 test pieces here. They're the same length, and I've got the same width. I'm just going to start mitering one end of each one, and then we'll come back and miter the opposite ends, and we'll show you how to assemble a frame to test if you've got an exact 45-degree setup on your miter gauge. Okay, so there is one end mitered. Now I need to miter the opposite end. And it's also important that, in this case, I want a square frame. All 4 pieces are going to end up the same length. That's where this comes in. This particular miter gauge comes with its own stop block built on. You can just as easily make a stop block by taking a piece of scrap and clamping it right to the face of your auxiliary fence. So I'm going to flip this down, turn my piece around and adjust this so I'm making a cut on the opposite end. And the important thing to remember, of course, is that your miters face each other. So there I'm cut, so I'm just taking off as little as possible. I'm going right through the corner of my cuts. So I'll cut each of these 4 pieces, and we'll assemble our frame. Now for a quick assembly, I think it's easy just to go ahead and do this right up against the rip fence on the table saw. It gives you one solid surface to work with. Put one there, 2, 3, and now I can check my 4 corners. 2 up against the rip fence are nice and tight. This 3rd one down here is nice and tight. Up there, we've got a pretty good gap. And it looks like things are splaying this way, so we need to take just a little bit off the heel of each one of these cuts, the inside corner of each one of these miters. This is going to be a very small adjustment because, again, 8 cuts, and I want to take essentially 1/8 of that error off each miter. Now, make an adjustment that fine. I could try adjusting the miter gauge, but there's a simpler way, and I think even it allows you to fine-tune better. Just take a business card or a playing card and put it behind the piece toward the end that needs to be touched up a little bit. Now I want to move the piece out this way to increase that angle, so I'm going to put the business card right back there and get a piece of tape just to hold it in place so it doesn't move during my 8 different cuts. My first cut, I'm going to move the stop in just a little bit, so I've going to shave just a little bit off that, make one cut on each end of all 4 pieces, move the stop in just a little bit more, and chop the other end. So let's do that. We'll check our fit. With one end of each piece cut, I move the stop in slightly before cutting the opposite end of each piece. There, we've got a pretty good fit with one business card adjustment. I think we've got things dialed in where we want, and we are ready to start cutting the actual pieces for our frame. Okay, so here are the 4 pieces for my frame, and I'm going to glue them up using a band clamp. These are very handy when you come time to glue up 4 mitered pieces. If you try to hold 4 mitered pieces, well, you saw a little bit of that, the saw, you try to hold all 4 corners at once, they slide a little bit on each other. A band clamp like this will grab each corner and pull them all toward the center, gets the joints nice and tight, keeps things from slipping around. Gluing it up, not too difficult. Just a dab of glue on each miter. And like when you're edge joining boards, you want to make sure that glue covers the full surface. I put some brown paper down on top of my bench top to make sure I don't get any glue on the bench, or even worse, glue the frame to the bench top. And I've got the 4 pieces in approximate position. Just tug on that band to cinch things up and tighten this screw down to pinch the band. And now a twist of the handle to help tighten things up further. You're going to have to slide pieces against each other, make sure the inside and outside corners are aligned. And do work quickly. I can feel the glue already starting to grab on this one. Okay, inside and outside corners all aligned. And don't have to get too Herculean on our effort here for the band clamp, just enough to keep those corners closed. And I can see that the frame is also lying nice and flat on the bench. It doesn't have any twist to it. That's good. So now, with like any other glue up, allow that to dry for at least an hour, preferably longer, before I remove the clamps. As I mentioned, miter joints are really an inherently weak joint. You've got end grain to end grain. So it's best to, if you have a frame, to reinforce those miter joints if you can. And as I said, there's going to be 4 ways to do that I'll show you. Our first is pretty simple. It's using good old wire nails. Now you don't want to take these and just grab the hammer and start driving these home. You're going to end up splitting your frame. Instead, put a drill bit in your drill and drill pilot holes for the nails. So there's one method. Now obviously the nails may not be the most attractive option. Another way you can do the same thing with a mechanical fastener, isn't quite as obvious, is with a pin nailer. This is, I believe, a 22 gauge. It runs off compressed air. And just a couple of quick shots. You're going to have to look closely. The heads of those pins are very, very small, so they're very difficult to see, which is the idea. So there's 2 of our 4 methods. Our third involves putting a gusset across the corner. We'll take essentially a little bite out of this corner, about like that, and then glue in a piece of wood to reinforce that corner, getting a lot of face grain to face grain glue surface. Now, you can make that is called a gusset. You can put that gusset across the back of the frame so it's hidden, or you can treat it as an accent, a design accent, perhaps glue in a contrasting species and put it on the front of the frame. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put it in on the front of the frame, and what we'll do is go to the table saw, cut a shallow groove across here to accept that gusset. This is the stock I'm going to use for the gusset. It's going to be some maple that will contrast, I think, nicely with the mahogany, especially when I get a finish on it. So I need to cut a gap, or a recess in the corner of the frame. That's actually just a little bit less than the thickness of my gusset. So I'm going to just use this as a gauge right next to the blade to set my blade height. I want the top of the blade just below the top of my gusset material. Lock the blade height in place, and that's taken care of. I want to make that cut so it's just, I'm going to leave it about 1/4 inch or so from the inside corner of the frame. So now I need to position that using my stop block on my miter gauge. I'm just going to kind of eyeball this one. The measurement isn't critical. I like the look of that there. So I'm going to bring the stop block up and lock that in place. The reason for the stop block is if I was doing this on all 4 corners, I could then just rotate the frame there and make a cut there for the next gusset. I'm all set. Let's start making our cut. If I was gusseting all 4 corners, I'd make the shoulder cut on each one before moving the stop block back. Repeated passes over the blade remove the remaining waste out to the corner. Now this would go a lot faster with a dado blade, but I wanted to show you that it can be done without one too. So there's my groove cut in here for my gusset. It's got a little cleanup to do. Do that back over the bench with a sanding block. That's looking pretty good. Take a look. Okay, that's a pretty good fit. That's just a smidge above the surface of the frame. I can easily sand that flush after I get the gusset glued in place here. What I need to do now is mark the length of the piece of my gusset. It's just about there, a little over long. Take that to the table saw, cut that off, come back and glue it in. You can glue your gusset in just about any grain orientation you please. If you want to, again, create an accent with the grain orientation of the frame. This one I'm going to go ahead and just glue it in so I think I like it actually running the same direction as the mahogany. So some glue in the recess here. Rub it around my trusty glue spreader. Put that in position. Clamp it. So I took a moment there to cut down and sand that gusset flush. It's nice and flush to the outside faces, and it gives, if you look at just the one corner there, it gives a nice accent. You can imagine that in the other 4 corners be a nice accent for the frame. Now the 4th method for reinforcing a miter is the spline, as I mentioned. I'm going to do it on this corner here, and I've marked this one just so I don't cut into the nails that I put in previously. A spline is, think of the gusset, only you're going to put it into the middle of the thickness of these 2 pieces. I'm going to use the same material I used for my gusset. And to get that in there, I obviously need to cut a slot right through the center of the thickness of these frame pieces. We'll do that over the table saw with a special sled. Here's the sled, and it's really fairly simple. Just a piece of MDF here, and I've got 2 other narrow pieces of MDF that are glued on here at a 90-degree angle to each other, and they're each at 45 degrees to the table. This is going to be a cradle that carries the frame past the blade to make that cut. We have to do a little bit of setup first. First, I want to know how deep to make that cut. This particular spline, I want to go about 3/4 of an inch deep. All right, now I'm just going to rest this in the cradle here, bring it up next to the blade, and raise the blade so it's the highest tooth just touches that line. Alrighty, I'm going to lock the height adjustment so the blade doesn't drift downward. Next I have to adjust this so that I can position that cut right in the center. To do that, I know my frame is 3/4 of an inch thick, so I'm going to set the blade just a little more than 3/8 of an inch to one side. Bring the rip fence up. This rides against the rip fence. So adjust the rip fence so that the edge of the jig is just a little over 1/4 of an inch from the tooth, and that'll give me a gap that's probably just under 1/4 inch, but I'll widen this with some small adjustments as we go. Now before I make a cut in my frame, I'm going to make a test cut, just to make a slot through the jig itself so I can double check my rib fence placement. Yep, I think that's where I want to start, so I'm ready to start making slots in the frame. Okay, just a little bit narrow. I'm going to make an adjustment, recut the slot, and we should be right on the money. Okay, I'm at the point where I've got a very, very close fit. So close that I don't think I want to make that fine of an adjustment on my table saw. What I'm going to do instead is sand this spline just a little bit to get the perfect fit. There we go, nice fit there. Now what I'm going to do is just going to cut off a small piece of this spline material, glue it in here, and then after the glue dries, like we did with the gusset, we'll trim and sand it flush with the edges.